Tēnā koutou katoa, ka mihi nui ki a koutou. My name is Tim Mackenzie. I'm the vicar in this church, and it's really lovely to welcome you all here for the first of our Stuff That Matters sessions this evening. About 18 months ago, we did a kind of little series which we called the Spring Series, and it was really energising and a lot of fun, I think. Some good discussions, some good friendships, and some good refreshments along the way too. So we're hopeful that the same thing is going to happen. I think for those who are regularly people who come to church, it's a chance to perhaps have some slightly deeper conversations at more length than we get away with on a Sunday morning. And for those who don't usually come to church, I think it's also a really good time and space to have conversations about stuff that matters. There are not that many forums in life outside educational institutions where we get to kind of thrash things through and have these kind of discussions. So welcome one and all. It's great to be able to get underway. Tonight's topic is losing our religion, and I'm personally hopeful that the answer is that we're not, because otherwise I'm out of a job. But we shall see. Our speakers tonight are Dr. Fountain and Dr. Geoff Troughton, who are both from the Religious Studies program at Victoria University. Geoff studied at Massey under New Zealand's premier religious historian Peter Lynham, and Philip studied in ANU in Canberra and did field work all over the place. And they form a formidable duo. So why don't we give them a big hand as they come and share with us losing our religion.
Kia ora and good evening. Geoff and I are delighted to be here this evening with you all. Can you hear me okay? It's loud enough? Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We both work in the Religious Studies program at Victoria University of Wellington. Our program holds the distinguished place as one of the longest running religious studies departments in the country. And indeed, this year we celebrate our 50th anniversary. When the program was first established, Lloyd Gearing, the founding professor of religious studies, was widely known across the country as the most articulate proponent of a scientific critique of Christian supernaturalism. Some took his work as a signal that the entire foundations of religion were fading away, to be soon replaced by rational and objective deliberation. I'm not so sure at all about the latter, but it is a former that concerns Geoff and I, and indeed our conversation this evening. The question as to whether religion is fading or not. Are we losing our religion? This talk is part of a series on stuff that matters, and this question, whether we're losing our religion or not, does indeed matter. Here we are in St. Michael's, and some of you, at least, are deeply invested in the institution of the Christian church. Rumours of the decline of religion in New Zealand no doubt keeps many a minister, glances at Tim, up late at night worrying about the future. But we don't think the question of religion's trajectories is a subject that matters exclusively to religious people. It matters to us all. We need to have better, smarter, and more informed public conversations about religion. The moral requirement to do so was laid down on us by events that unfolded at the start of last year. The Christchurch mosque attacks of the 15th of March 2019 resulted in the deaths of 51 Muslims as they gathered in prayer. The perpetrator appears to have specifically sought out Muslim worship spaces in order to commit mass murder. This event shattered popular imaginations of New Zealand exceptionalism, a safe place to raise your kids. Those kind of things don't happen here. It did happen here. We now live within the wake of this tragedy. The attacks disrupted our cone of silence around religion. To some of us, at least, New Zealand's cultivated religious illiteracy no longer seems quite so advantageous. At the time of the attacks, I was partway through teaching a first-year course, introducing students to religious studies. In the lectures over the weeks that followed, I found myself at a loss for words. What could possibly be said that would do justice to those who were suffering? I am still not too sure of the answer. And yet, there is much to talk about concerning the attacks and the aftermath. One of the outcomes is that, against what the attacker had imagined, Islam gained a new public presence in New Zealand. I remember standing on the grounds of the Kilburnie Mosque with piles of flowers and cards and statements of solidarity laid out in front. Indeed, up and down the country, mosques became public spaces for entire communities to gather and mourn. Muslim prayer was heard across the country, often for the first time. A week after the attacks, I joined Victoria University of Wellington colleagues and students to listen to an Arabic Muslim prayer, broadcast live and shown on the big screen in the hub. Bishop Ali was with the religious leaders in Parliament when, for the first time ever, an imam opened their session with an Arabic prayer. Our colleague, Eva Nisa, was interviewed repeatedly by New Zealand and global media outlets about Muslim communities in New Zealand. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern donned the headscarf when she visited Christchurch and so opened new public conversations about the clothing and practices of religious minorities. These emergences involved new public conversations about religion in New Zealand, but they also highlighted just how anemic our knowledge of religion had become. A couple of months ago, I took two friends on a tiki tour of Wellington. They were both development workers who, for years, had been working in and around the United Nations and various other NGOs and humanitarian organizations. Most of this work had taken place, their work had taken place, in North Africa and the Middle East. They are my kind of people, cosmopolitan, quick-witted, and a bit jaded, but not without good reason. As we drove around Oriental Parade and up and down Mount Victoria, we chewed over things. At one point, the conversation swung to me, and I was asked how things were going teaching religious studies. Oh, kia ora, thanks. In Wellington, I provided a little anthropological background to the challenges of teaching religion in New Zealand, namely, that I think that most of my students who come to Victoria University of Wellington assume that religion is declining and is increasingly irrelevant for what is taken to be the substantive political and economic issues. Both my friends, when I provided this background, burst out laughing. They kept laughing for some minutes. After some time, I sought to keep the conversation moving, and I was unable to do so. The laughter continued unabated. Finally, after recovering themselves, they apologized, and they swore they had never heard anything quite so absurd. Let me be clear that I do not tell this story to cast aspersions about the intelligence of my students. Victoria University of Wellington prides itself in taking in the best and the brightest. This is not about student smarts. It is rather a pointed critique of desperately inadequate public discourse about religion that we have in this country. And this is indeed a problem. For many international observers, the exact opposite view holds sway. Religion is increasingly relevant for all manner of political and economic concerns. Diverse religions play vital roles in shaping international conflicts, protests and attempts at regime change, economic challenges and new markets, migration and refugee crises, and new possibilities for addressing environmental sustainability. Think of evangelical support for Trump. Think Narendra Modi and BJP's Hindu nationalism. Think the Arab Spring. Think the Islamic revival since the 1970s. Think the ongoing Syrian conflict. Think geopolitical tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Think conflict between Palestine and Israel. In 2012, Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, publicly embraced President Vladimir Putin as a miracle of God, and in so doing illustrated just how dramatically church-state relations had changed in Russia since the communist era. In a 2017 speech 2 years before becoming the president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro declared, "God above everything. There is no such thing as the secular state." In recent years, commentators have declared that China is facing an unprecedented Buddhist revival, that it is awash with Taoist and folk religious movements, that it is on track to becoming the world's most Christian nation in terms of the number of Christian adherents, and that it may also well become the world's most Muslim nation as well. All this, of course, makes the Chinese government very nervous. Inciting these anxieties, protesters in Hong Kong famously sang Christian hymns as their anthems of solidarity and defiance. Closer to home, populations across the Pacific continued to affiliate with Christianity at remarkable rates. It is, quite probably, the most solidly Christian part of the world. Christian affiliation in numerous parts of the Pacific exceeds 97%. Anthropologists Matt Tomlinson and Deborah McDougall argue that Christianity is, this is a quote, "the ground and starting point for political action," end quote, across the region, and that Christianity and politics are, another quote, "inseparable at any level of analysis." Back in the 1960s and 1970s, some sociologists speculated that the world was becoming increasingly secular and would soon abandon religion altogether. This secularization thesis is now utterly discredited. Instead, entire libraries have been written to try to grasp the current global resurgence of religion. Given these dynamics, the nonchalant Kiwi meh about religion registers as a most remarkable parochialism, the sort of view that could only ever be imagined from a country on the edges of the known universe. It involves a head-in-the-sand level of ignorance that leaves New Zealand largely incapable of grasping the sea changes taking place elsewhere. It also leaves us poorly located to understanding the changes that are taking place here. So what is taking place here? As the world gets religion, are we bucking the trend and losing it? In order to explore this question, we need to think a little bit more about who we are as a country. The short answer as to who we are is that New Zealand's population of just under 5 million people is changing. In these changes, migration is a significant factor. In the year ending July 2019, New Zealand had just under 150,000 migrant arrivals and 96,000 migrant departures, leading to a net annual migration gain of just over 50,000 people. The arrivals included almost 20,000 people from China, over 12,000 from India, and over 8,000 from the Philippines. Almost half the departures were New Zealand citizens. As an interesting point of comparison, in 2019, the birth rate was just under 60,000, and almost 35,000 people passed away, leaving the natural increase at 25,000. The most significant factor currently contributing to population growth in New Zealand is migration. Migration has resulted in significant changes to the ethnic profile of the country. 1 in 4 Aucklanders were born outside the country. Similarly, but by no means a direct overlap, 1 in 4 Aucklanders are of Asian descent. Just after the Second World War, only 2,200 Pacific Islanders lived in New Zealand. But now Auckland alone has a Pacifica community of over 200,000. It is the world's most Polynesian city. By the middle of this decade, it is estimated that the Pacific Island population in New Zealand will be closer to 500,000 people. These migration patterns are reconfiguring religious practice. My cousin's family in Auckland attends a Roman Catholic church. She actually just sent it to me, but I've already forgotten it. Apologies. Attends a Roman Catholic parish, which, by their accounts, is full to overflowing with multiple services each weekend. The pews are full of Filipinos, Ghanaians, Tongans, Indonesians, and Latin Americans. Similarly, this image of those who attend Al-Nur Mosque in Christchurch, one of the mosques which was at the center of the attacks last year, illustrates the remarkable ethnic diversity of Islam in New Zealand. But migration is only one of the factors at play in our changes. A fascinating sociological study initiated by the late Vern Bankston has traced changes in family dynamics over 4 generations of California families over a period of nearly 50 years. Bankston discovered a sea change in the ways different generations talk about religion. In their book, Families and Faith, Bankston and colleagues show that history does not unfold in a straight line. Instead, it moves forward in lurches and jolts. In the US, the 1960s, with its revolutions in sexuality and civil rights, produced a radical disjuncture between earlier generations and their descendants, resulting in entirely new ways of talking about religion and spirituality. Our period of radical transition was probably, I think, a little bit later, in the 1970s and 80s, and it included some other pivots. Yet, it is also entirely plausible that parallel dramatic generational transformations have taken place here too, with consequences that we have barely begun to understand. The youth ain't what they used to be is probably a cliche among every group of old-timers over the entire history of humanity. But this doesn't mean that it isn't true, or that it isn't especially true today. Given these transformations to New Zealand society, what do we know about the current state of religion in this country? Geoff, hand it over to you.
Kia ora. So, we know quite a bit in terms of numbers, and what I'm going to present is a number of data that give us some insights into the most recent statistics that we have. Don't get bogged down in the detail. It's the trends and the bigger picture that I want to put in front of you. So I'm sure many of you will be aware that we had a census that was undertaken in 2018. There are a lot of problems associated with that census, and I think there's a lot about the religion data that is problematic. I'm not going to worry so much about the problems, but point more to the bigger picture things that we know. And part of what we know from that emerges from the census data from 2018 is the continuation of some trends that we knew were happening already for some time. And there are 3 big trends that I think come out of the data that we have. The first is data related to the decline of Christian identification. So we know that the data suggests that 37% of New Zealanders identify with Christianity in 2018, down from about 47% in the previous census. Now, we could add in Ratana and Ringatu identification, which would lift that about another percent, but still we're talking under 40% identification with Christianity. And it's a markedly reconfigured Christianity. At the 2013 census, Catholics for the first time became the largest single group in New Zealand's history. Now 10% of New Zealanders identify with Catholicism. Anglicans now only representing just over 6%. So down from historically, for about 100 years, being about 40% of the population to just 6%. And those who are Christian but claim no other further denominational identity, roughly the same at about 6%. So the first big story, the data in pink, this decline in Christian identification, the increase in no religion, up to 48% in 2018, up from near enough to 42% 5 years previous. And then the sort of purple lilac-y delicate shade at the bottom, increasing of other religions, about 8.1%, up from 6% in the most recent census. Now that other category captures a whole lot of different things, everything from Satanism through to Sikh religion. But the main groups are Hindu, 2.65%, Muslim, 1.3% of the population, Buddhist, 1.1%, Sikh, 0.88%, which represents a growth from just 5,000 affiliates in 2001 up to over 40,000 identifying with that faith in 2018. About 44, just under 45% of New Zealanders identified with at least one religious tradition. And so to put that first story of declining Christian affiliation in some sort of context, over the long history of New Zealand's censuses, there was roughly 100 years where about 95% or more of New Zealanders would put down on a census form that they identified with one or other form of Christianity. But then over the last 50 years, there's been this really quite predictable, quite stable and quite sharp decline, beginning from the 1960s. Between 1991 and 2006, that was almost a static number of people identifying with Christianity, but it wasn't a population that was keeping pace with population increases. So the numbers of Christians hardly changed at all over that 15-year period, but there was still this proportional decline in the population. And since then, it's been roughly 30,000 people per year disaffiliating in terms of the proportionalities. Roughly 1% per year over the past 50 years is what it adds up to. Now, that's quite sharp levels of disaffiliation. In places like the US, the UK, Australia, there's also a pattern of disaffiliation from Christianity, but not at the same levels or at the same rates as New Zealand. There are some other places. The Netherlands has a very similar trajectory to New Zealand, but it is quite a striking change. To put that in the global or the wider global context, we're used to this, thinking about this story of Christian decline in New Zealand as essentially being a global story. But it's not. Actually, this decline in identification in New Zealand is in the context of 100 years and more of Christianity representing about 31% of the population. And the projections from Pew, which is a kind of consistent projection that they've been doing over about the last 10 years, suggests that by 2060, even 2070, there will be roughly the same proportion of Christians in the world then as there are now. The number of Muslims will increase quite dramatically, and by 2070 the projection is that there will be more Muslims in the world than Christians. But by that stage, actually the world will have more people identifying with religion proportionally than do now, with lots of assumptions built into all of how that works. And one of the most striking things that in our part of the world, certainly the students that come into religious studies are always very surprised to see, is the line on the right in the middle in grey of the unaffiliated, those who claim no religion, that the global share of those who are unaffiliated is projected to drop from around 16%, if I can read it properly, down to 13% over the next 40 or 50 years. So no religion globally is on the decline as a proportion of population. So that's a story of Christians and Muslims growing at the same or significantly more in the case of Muslims than the overall projected growth rate around the world. Another part of the context of Christian decline is of a New Zealand in which Christian institutions still exist on an extraordinary scale and are woven in many ways to the culture and to the fabric of the nation. There's a project based at the University of Auckland that's seeking to map out all the places of worship, educational places, town halls, civic institutions, and trying to build up a longitudinal historical picture of the development of these institutions. And this map currently displays about 2,500 places of worship, that's Christian and other, which is roughly the same number of places as there are educational institutions. This is not including religious communities that meet in school buildings, that meet in halls, that meet in houses, that meet in kind of places that are not designated places of worship, simply particular houses of worship. And what that points to, I think, is a landscape in which there is this other educational, formational space that is of long standing that shapes culture, shapes people in profound ways. And some of the data that we are drawing out is demonstrating the importance of these centres as locations of charity, of volunteering, of the formation of all kinds of values and practices that make a material difference to the way that people imagine the world and live in it. And we'll come back to some of that data shortly. One of the other contextual things to note is that this data around the profile of religions in New Zealand makes New Zealand a place that is properly can be identified as highly diverse. On a global scale, the levels of religious diversity in New Zealand are high, if not very high. Pew again has done this work on the Religious Diversity Index, and you'll see that out of 232 nations that they run the numbers on, New Zealand ranks 22nd. And in fact, this data comes from 2010 statistics, so it doesn't even capture the huge increase in South Asian migration that has taken place since the census and government statistics that they drew on. And so New Zealand's Religious Diversity Index now would be significantly higher than this. We are unusual in the level to which religious diversity is actually a part of our religious landscape. And this religious diversity, as Philip has already highlighted, it interacts very significantly with changing ethnic profile of the nation. This is a project based in, it's a global project in which Auckland has been part of a study looking at Vancouver, Auckland and Sydney. And the graphic tries to create some of these connections between ethnicity on the one side and religious identification on the other. You can't really make sense of it there, but I draw it to your attention and give the reference. But some of the things that it helps to visualise is the way that these dimensions interact. In Auckland in 2013, we can see, for example, the ways that non-religion is very strongly ethnically shaped. About 45% of Europeans, about 45% of Māori, and a substantial proportion of Chinese make up the largest share of that no religion category. We look at the Indian ethnicity and we see that Hindus, surprise, surprise, are almost all Indian. Some of this data actually throws up some surprises probably for us. For example, the way that about 30% of Asian New Zealanders actually identify with Christianity. And so there are complex configurations of the religions unfolding. There's new diversity within Christianity that is also connected with fragmentations that are taking place within the Christian landscape. That finding about Māori being identifying with no religion at the same levels as European or Pākehā New Zealanders is perhaps surprising to many. And I think that is a really important point that should cause us to be asking lots of questions about some of these categories. This kind of data, religious, non-religious, does not capture notions of spirituality. It doesn't capture the way that Māori might think about their prayer, their karakia, the way that they engage with tupunua, the way they think about tikanga. Nor does it capture the ways that secular New Zealand Pākehā or New Zealand Europeans might think about these things as they become more open and receptive to tikanga Māori, as is evidently happening at present. It raises lots of obvious questions about some of these categories. And so what I want to do is to tease out a little bit of what we know from other sources about some of the how religious identities and practices are being worked out. Because saying that you have no religion does not make you... it tells it's a negation. It's a label that says I'm not something. Even if we know what that something of religion means, it's purely a negation, and it tells us nothing about people's actual identities, their ideas, their beliefs and their practices. But we do have some sources that give us some pretty rich insights. I've been privileged over the last number of years to be involved with the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Studies, which was started in 2009. It aims to be a 20-year longitudinal study, currently halfway through that. And at the last sample that was taken involved nigh on 48,000 respondents to the study, taken from a random sample of the New Zealand electoral roll. I suspect that means that there's probably people here, at least one or two, who are involved in the study. This is an extraordinary study in global terms. There's absolutely nothing like it anywhere in the world that samples that kind of proportion of the population, asking the wide range of questions that this study does. And fortunately, it was set up by Chris Sibley, who was a graduate from Victoria in psychology and religious studies. And he had the foresight in setting up the study to ask a number of questions about religion and people's religious beliefs and practices that enable some really rich exploration of people's beliefs and behaviours. So to take one very simple question, do you believe in God? Which is a question that is asked from time to time in the study. The survey highlights that over 20% of people who say they have no religion identify that they believe in God. So that's the group across to the left. You're not going to be able to see the details very well, I'm sorry. You'll have to take my word for it and ask questions later. Then if we ask people, do you believe in some kind of life, or incidentally, it's interesting to note that there's quite a lot of Anglicans and Presbyterians and other identifying Christians who don't believe in God either, particularly Anglicans. I don't know if that's a surprise. Over 60% of people who say they have no religion also say that they believe in some kind of life force or spirit. And you can see amongst the other religions very high levels of assent to that proposition as well, but also some groups that feel a bit funny about that kind of language for describing their beliefs. So Muslims, for example, there's this really high error bars that appear there. But what we know from other sources actually is that New Zealanders believe lots of things that might be a little bit surprising, that don't square with a thoroughly secular, non-religious kind of viewpoint. The ISSP data tells us that 40% of New Zealanders in that sample of about over 2,000 people were sampled in that survey, 40% believe that fortune tellers can foresee the future, and 25% or more of New Zealanders believe that good luck charms do indeed bring good luck, that star signs affect people's futures, they believe in the supernatural power of ancestors and in reincarnation. So, again, this raises all sorts of interesting questions. These are not beliefs that fit easily into normative Christian frameworks, nor do they sit very happily within frameworks of secular non-religion or atheism. So our categories of what no religion actually speaks to are complicated and very much more complicated than simple binaries. Similarly, these narratives of disaffiliation are much more complex than they may at first appear. You'll recall that the data that I showed you before showed this steady decline of Christianity, Christian affiliation over the last 50 years, clockwork-like almost, essentially 1% a year for 50 years, with a high level of predictability. But of course we know that it's not that everyone's just disaffiliating. We know that people's religious convictions and identities are quite fluid. Within Christianity, for example, there's high levels of movement between traditions. If we just look at year on year, how many people shift what they say their religious identity is, there's really high volatility in the survey. But if we look longitudinally, we can also see patterns unfolding that are really interesting. So the person with the little red mark on their collar, the red cross, indicates a religious affiliation. The one without indicates not religious affiliation. And you can see that the suggestion here is that there's a weighting, there's a movement in both directions. The movement is more solidly towards non-religion, but there is this backwards movement to religious affiliation that is also taking place. And indeed, when we break this down, the annual probability of disaffiliation along at the y-axis and then age across the x-axis, you can see that blue, which indicates disaffiliation, operates in a very different age profile to affiliation in the red. And so the story is that the older that you get, actually the more likely you are to affiliate with Christianity. In fact, there comes a point where you're more likely to become religious, which mainly means Christian in this context. You're more likely to affiliate than disaffiliate. Similarly, we find similar kind of stories unfolding for God belief. There is declining God belief in New Zealand over time, roughly about 2% with each wave, but also very low rates back towards belief in God, about 1% going in the other direction. But again, there's really different age profiles to how this is working. Again, this crossover, the older you get, the more likely you are actually to start believing in God later in life. When it comes to spirit belief, actually it's really stable. This roughly 70-odd%, maybe more, of New Zealanders who have a belief in spirit or life force remain stable, and there's absolutely no difference in the way that this works out for different ages, the kind of levels of belief and disbelief there track along the age bands. So overall, we have fairly stable belief in spirit, whatever that actually means, whatever that actually adds up to. Briefly, I want to point out a number of ways about why these kinds of commitments, religious commitments, are actually consequential. They actually make a difference to the way people imagine the world and live in it. And one of the studies I want to highlight relates to attitudes to immigrants, and in particular Muslims. So we know that in New Zealand, the data from the NZAVS tells us that actually over the last 7 or 8 years, there's been really no change in the obvious levels of nationalism or patriotism amongst New Zealanders. These are pretty stable. People make the same kind of responses year on year about how they feel about these sorts of issues. But we know that that doesn't mean that everybody has a great experience of inclusion in New Zealand. And there's quite significant differentiation when people are asked how warmly they feel about different groups of immigrants to New Zealand, or different social groups in New Zealand, that we get quite significant differences. For our purposes here, the most important point is the way that Muslims and Arabs are quite strikingly recipients of less expressions of warmth than any other social group that the study measures. And the conflation of Muslims with Arabs there is also really striking, and it's from other work that we've done on the study, it's really clear that this is a product of media consumption, that the conflation of Muslim with Arab is something that is a product of the way that Islam is represented in the news. Because actually in New Zealand, only about 25% of Muslims come from the Middle East or Africa, and only a portion of those are Arab. But in many people's minds, this is what these two terms both refer to the same thing. Now, you might think that what's driving that level of low warmth to Muslims might be a product of religious bigotry or religious conflict or competition. But what our study demonstrated is actually that the more strongly people identify with their religion, the more likely they are to express warmth and welcome to Muslims. So those who express on a scale of 1 to 7 how important is your religion to how you see yourself, 7 being very high, 0 being not at all important, the higher the number that people reported that religion was important to them, the more they expressed warmth to Muslims. But again, it's complicated. It breaks down in really interesting ways. Men in blue on the right express much less warmth than women, but it's exactly the same track. More highly identified men who identify highly with their religion express more warmth than men who don't identify with religion. Same with women. There's also really important generational differences. Again, exactly the same slant. The more religious a person says they are, whatever age they are, the more likely they are to express warmth to Muslims, and indeed it relates to other groups too. But there's generational differences. Younger people, they're much more likely to express warmth than older generations, much less likely. And so this finding that young people are much warmer to others is really quite striking, because in the same study, young people also expressed much more concern and anxiety about experiencing a terrorist attack. They saw themselves as more vulnerable to the potential terrorist violence, but also expressed more warmth to Muslims who, in the general imagination, were regarded as being the most threatening group. So this is also unfolding in a context, this pattern is unfolding in a context in which highly identified religious people are increasingly seeing themselves as being discriminated against and under threat themselves. So it's quite an interesting finding the way that this strength of identification works. Also really important here, I think, is not actually just the way that religious people identify, how strongly they identify, but actually how people generally feel about religion. We did a subsequent study looking at this factor. What's your attitude to religion? Do you think religion's a good thing? Do you think it's a helpful thing in the world? Do you think it's a positive thing? Or do you see it as a problem? And actually, again, we get this slope. The more that you think that religion actually does some good in the world, the more likely you are to express that warmth and openness to Muslims and indeed to other groups. And this is true for people who say they have no religion or some religion as well. The more that they see religion as being a positive thing, doing good things in the world, the more likely they are to express warmth and openness to other people of other religions and from other communities. And so one of the things that this data, I guess, is showing that maybe complicates some of the things that census data can tell us about religion is the way that the impacts of religious identification, not just whether you say yes or no, am I religious or not, but what kind of religious are you and how important is that religion to you, really makes an observable difference across a wide range of fields, whether it's from fertility to attitudes to climate change and environmental issues, through to patterns of charity and volunteering. The strength of people's religious identification cuts at real joints about how people behave in the world much more strongly than yes or no religion. But I think that data, what it does for us is should raise lots of important questions about what the domains of religion and non-religion are and the ways in which it actually matters.
Little switcheroo. As Geoff has discussed, there is much we can learn from the data currently available about religion in New Zealand. And there also remains a lot that we would still like to find out. Part of this attempt to find out will involve further research, such as undertaken by the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Study, of which Geoff is a part and mentioned. But another part will involve qualitative approaches, such as interviews, ethnography, and textual analysis, which have the capacity to address questions of meaning in detailed and textured ways. The problem is that over the past couple of decades, little qualitative research has taken place on New Zealand's changing religious landscape. This is regrettable. One of our goals in religious studies at Victoria University of Wellington is to plug some of these research gaps. Geoff and I have had the privilege of supervising some outstanding postgraduate students, and I hope you will indulge us if we talk briefly about some of their projects. Do you want to talk about the last two, or shall I do them all? Okay, we'll roll through them real quick. Vida Long is just about finishing a master's project looking at women's poetry in New Zealand, and she's developed a really innovative way of thinking through the question of religion. She thinks that women poets who use religious metaphors and imagery are doubly marginalized from the canon of New Zealand poetry. She talks about the ways in which religion and secularism do not operate as a binary, but in fact spirituality is a key part of the ways in which religious ideas and images have been picked up and deployed. She's not interested in religious poetry as such, poetry by religious people. She's interested in the ways in which those ideas reverberate out, and she finds that when you begin to look, they're everywhere. Jake Searell is doing a study of Pacifica communities and family violence, and particularly the way in which the New Zealand state goes about engaging with Pacifica churches in order to deal with family violence. His fascinating study spends a lot of time looking at the ways in which Pacifica Christians who work for state agencies, be it ministries or NGOs that receive government funding and so on, the ways in which these Pacifica Christians understand that their religiosity and their ethnicity are really closely connected, and that when they can't engage in a conversation about religion, and some of them articulate striking senses of "I'd lose my job if," kind of thing, that this results in a profound discrimination, essentially a silencing of Pacifica communities who are no longer able to engage in that sort of language and that conversation. Jake talks about the ways in which state secularism in New Zealand as an implicit backdrop, and indeed for him this is particularly a Wellington phenomena, the ways in which state secularism inhibits and forecloses opportunities to address Pacific Island family violence, and for him that's a real problem. Another student of ours, Kelly Kuhn, is studying sustainability and Christian farmers in New Zealand, and she's found in her research that Christian farmers throughout the country are talking about sustainability, and they're engaging with this as a matter of faith. And this is a really important finding. It's important because hardly anyone looks at rural religion in New Zealand these days. But even though she found that people were really willing to talk about it, she also found that no one had asked them these questions before. Not in their church, not in their farming communities, not in the broader public discourse. And maybe, just lastly, a student just submitted her honours thesis about a week ago, in fact on Monday this week. And Dominique Orange is her name, and she explores religious memes in New Zealand. She argues that public religion is no longer a matter of formal media, and more attention is needed to the rise of new forms of digital publics. She also observes that by far and away the two most dominant themes within memes on New Zealand religion concern Brian Tamaki and Gloria Vale, both of which are viewed overwhelmingly pejoratively. So in this public, religion is only ever the object of ridicule and mockery. We have been arguing, Geoff and I, that New Zealand has a problem, both with religious illiteracy and with the state of our public conversations about religion. Over the past few decades, narratives of religious decline and its concomitant increasing irrelevance have assumed the status of, apparently, unchallengeable orthodoxy. But this myth of decline is at odds with reality. Census statistics do show declining affiliation with Christianity and a growth of those with no religion, the nuns. But this doesn't tell us anything like the whole story. The narrative of decline has impoverished our capacity to think through the dynamic changes currently taking place within the country. These changes include rapid growth in religious diversity and new interest in various forms of spirituality. We need to have better conversations, and we have sought to show that this is possible. Research coming out of the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Study and new qualitative studies about what it means to live religious and secular lives in contemporary New Zealand help advance a state of this conversation. In conclusion, we want to talk directly to Christians who perhaps feel a bit daunted by the religious changes we have discussed. First, we encourage you not to be afraid of religious difference. New Zealand is becoming more diverse, and as it does so, it is important we learn how to interact together. We need to learn to talk publicly about our religious differences. This will require us to develop religious literacy beyond our own traditions. there are very good theological reasons for seeking to expand our religious literacy. The primary one, as Geoff and I see it, is that adequate care, indeed love, of your neighbour demands a listening attentively to their stories. Second, as part of our advice, don't despair about declining affiliations with Christianity. Yes, Christianity is becoming a minority religion in this country, and there will be some pain for those who remember its former status. But a loss of control need not be viewed exclusively as negative. The collapse of a Constantinian assumption of authority and status may prove to be a remarkable blessing. Indeed, you don't have to be in charge. You can join the other minorities, and there is much to benefit from this. Becoming a minority does not necessarily mean vacating a public role. Even though you won't perhaps get to set the table, you should sit down at it and contribute to the conversation. Your most valuable contributions won't necessarily involve advancing normative theological assertions, but you have a rich heritage to draw upon in thinking about ethics, practices, ontologies, ritual, generosity, and hope. And these are good things to share. Further, the rapid growth of non-religion doesn't necessarily mean that New Zealanders lack attentiveness to goodness, truth, and beauty, or indeed spirituality and transcendence. And as you contribute your understandings, you should trust that others have the wisdom and grace to learn from these. Finally, these changing dynamics are not just happening outside your churches, but inside as well. Learning to be hospitable will involve learning new ways of welcoming and celebrating ethnic diversity and young people who may very well have vastly different religious expectations. Indeed, again, the primary task here is that of listening. And unless your leadership structures and decision makers reflect this generational and ethnic diversity, you won't be able to adequately engage with that. Kia ora, and thank you.
Thank you very much to you both. I reckon we've got about 15 minutes for questions, 10 or 15 minutes. I was reminded of a story that Rosie Fife, who St Michael's people will know, she worked for the Anglican Church in Cairo for a long time, that she shared, which was that the minute you get into a taxi in Cairo, someone says, "What religion are you?" Whereas in New Zealand, I don't think I've ever been asked that question in a taxi. Caitlin probably has. But intriguing to me. I guess my question would be, given that sort of really the sort of spiritual but not religious kind of data out there, this might be above your pay grade, but are we in the church just doing a really bad job of telling our story? If there's such openness to sort of... yeah.
Do you have something to say? Not really.
But other people might.
That's a way of dodging the question. Open it to the floor. It is above my pay grade, and I think yes.
Cheeky. All right, I should have brought the wireless mic, sorry, I didn't. Do we have any questions from the floor? Thank you. This is Jan Gould. She taught me social studies, or English, at Tawa College in 1066, and it's very nice to see you again.
It's meant to be 2020 years old. I actually have to say that I found this absolutely utterly fascinating, and for about a million years I've been teaching children's liturgy in the Catholic Church, and what's happened is that the demographic has completely changed. So most Sundays are between 50 and 30 children, and most of which talk about 2 or 3 languages. incredibly humbled by these children. And it does say something about our immigration policies because, my God, these kids are smart, so they're going through the you guys. And you'll have to be really watching where you're going, sort of watching your space. But my real thing is actually about cults. What we've been finding is that these marvellous young people, once they get to be teenagers, want to rush off and kind of save the world or do strange things, and get sort of caught up. And I have to disclose, including my own daughter, in these sort of very fringish organisations that really have all the hallmarks of the cult. So I just wondered whether you've got any comments about this.
Geoff does.
I'm not going to go the cults route, but I think what you raise is quite important questions about our presumptions about youth religious identities. And for the Catholic Church, it's a really interesting and difficult conundrum, I think, that the Church is heavily invested into an education system for a variety of reasons that is incredibly effective at bringing young people within its orbit. But whereas the other churches, so young people who stay involved with religion to some extent, they tend to report actually higher levels of engagement with their faith than their elders do. Like, all the data is coming through very similar, that they pray more, they read the Bible more, they kind of identify more strongly. And this is one of the generational issues, I think, particularly in traditional churches, that a lot of the older folk don't actually care that much, and the younger ones who are involved care but are not led in ways that reflect that. And so it's pretty easy to become disillusioned in that kind of context. But amongst Catholic young people, there is a striking level of disinterest. So lots of young people, and you ask how important religion is to how you see yourself, and it's miles lower. And there's this thing that we would call the Catholic age gap, where young Catholics, of whom there are many, have really low levels of identification, but their elders have really high levels of identification. And so there is a big challenge there in meeting this last point about the different expectations and different imaginations of faith. Like, it really places that into stark, whatever. But the attraction into cults, so to speak, I don't really like the language, but what it often reflects is people find a community that looks serious, that really cares, that is quite demanding, but that also promises a lot out of religious commitment. And if they want to be committed, but don't have a location where commitment is honoured or makes any sense or feels valuable, then they do find places where it does look like it will be honoured. So that's my reflection. I felt like I'd given the Anglicans a bit of a serve before, so...
You can ask that one afterwards. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I find it very interesting. Just wondering whether you have any correlation between the length of stay of migrants and their affiliation with religion. Christianity has been here for 180 years. I was wondering whether, with 180 years of migrants being here, will they have the same kind of trend that we have seen in New Zealand? Because I think once you come new to the country, you tend to cluster. And your place of congregation for social activity, for getting to know each other, is a temple or religious place. Has that been factored into your study?
The NZAVS doesn't have a 180-year horizon kind of built in, but if there's funding available, I'm sure they'd do it. The study of migrant religious communities I think it's really important in New Zealand. There's very little work going on in this, but what we do know is that amongst Pacifica migrants, so kind of second generation Pacific people in New Zealand, that there is a significant trail-off of religious identification amongst those, and so it is a bit of a pattern that the children and grandchildren of migrants do come closer to the prevailing norms in the culture in which they come to. But there's lots of different stories. That's like the story of Christian decline. It's much more complex, and there are different ways that communities preserve and cultivate and renew their religious identities in new situations. And so it's an important area of study, and it's a complicated area of study, but I think it is one that we're going to need to be paying close attention to. You probably know more about migrant religion than me.
Your answer is a good one. Yeah.
If I could just share my own experience, I go to the temple. My children used to go to the temple with me, and as they go down not going to the temple, the grandchildren don't go to the temple at all. So it's a reflection of the same trend that you're seeing, They probably go for spirituality rather than established religion.
So I think religion has a really bad press in New Zealand, and that'll be felt by young people, perhaps particularly acutely, almost irrespective of tradition. And however, I would caution against assuming that the trajectory of Christianity is necessarily the trajectory of any other group. I don't think that you have to assume a correlation, and yet religion's got some bad press. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Philip, I think this is probably addressed more to you, and partly because my first degree was in anthropology.
Awesome.
And so it's a combination of a little bit of an observation, but also a question for your comment. So let's start with a question. A lot of the stuff that you presented in terms of affiliation struck me as being framed in a very traditional academic way, which is it's about beliefs, we believe in God or not. Whereas one of the things that seems to me kind of more interesting about what I'm labelling an anthropological approach is close observation of practices. So in there is a question, which is, I'm interested in your comment about that and the limitations that don't get very far, don't get much traction if we just limit ourselves to questions about belief. And then, just to kind of give this a little bit more context, a kind of comment observation. Like a good anthropologist, these are participant observation things. So over the years I've sort of practiced Tai Chi and other martial arts and yoga. And of course some of those are simply like going to a gymnasium, physical exercises, but some of them, both martial arts, some practices of Tai Chi, some practices of yoga, without ever mentioning the word God or spirituality, without ever talking about beliefs, seem to be very clear manifestations of, for want of a better phrase, spiritual behaviours, spiritual practices. And then finally, if I remember correctly, a not very clear public report in a newspaper or something, one of your students in religious studies, perhaps ironically, perhaps the series of 10, was awarded a scholarship to continue his investigations of gym practices as forms of religious expression. So I'm interested in your comments about that, and I hope it's clear enough as a question to give you something to start with.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. Did you want to?
I can tell you that student now teaches strategic studies at Nesta University. Sorry, that was a necessary incursion.
I think our census suffers from being too Protestant when it comes to religion. It does seem to assume that religion is primarily a matter of belief and affiliation, and I think this misses most of what we could be interested in thinking through and discovering. Absolutely. So I think you're actually square on. I think religion as practice, religion as ritual, religion as ethic are all just as valid, perhaps even more so, in terms of figuring out the changes in the religious landscape today. I really wish we had more of a chance to delve into what our graduate students are doing, because the reason we wanted to include them there is mostly just to say how awesome they are, but also partly to talk about what a qualitative investigation would look like. And what we've done today is we drew particularly upon the statistical stuff. This is clearly, as should be obvious to you all, not my strong point, which is why I handed it over to Geoff. And certainly my interest from here moving forward is absolutely thick ethnography of the ways in which non-religious people live their non-religious lives. What does that mean in practice? And what does that look like? And what does it look like to live religious lives, quote unquote, in a context in which it is treated so pejoratively? And those questions, I think, are really where my heart lies, but also where that texture and detail can be played out in very interesting ways. I would love to get some money, if anyone has it, feel free to hand it to me, in order to get a number of doctoral students to do ethnographies of non-religious gatherings or religious gatherings up and down the country, including tiny little dying churches in the back of Beyond and so on, and thriving churches in the middle of multicultural Auckland, in order to do a kind of comparative stock take on this. And currently we don't have that kind of study being done.
Oh, the questions are flying thick and fast, and there's not that long to go, but if they're short questions, we can probably have 1, 2, 3, and then we'll go home. Deborah.
All right, it's a short one. You talked about religious literacy in this country, and I wondered how much you thought that was a result of, I think it is, of a lack of state religious education in New Zealand. There seems to be this almost pathological fear of religious indoctrination in schools. Coming from the UK, where we all have compulsory religious education, there's much more religious literacy amongst the young people, not necessarily religious affiliation, but they understand it a lot more. Just wondering what you thought about that.
Yes, and it's time to introduce that throughout the New Zealand curriculum, absolutely. Kia ora. Oh, I think it will happen, honestly. I don't think we can get away with our level of public discourse in the way we currently do. And I think that a range of politicians are coming around to this view as well. I absolutely anticipate new forms of religious education, certainly at high school, probably at primary, in the near future. And this will deal with the question of religious diversity in ways that, say, Bible in schools did not attempt to do so. And so I absolutely anticipate this. And I think genuinely this would be a significant advance, one that I would applaud and look forward to. That said, that's not going to deal with the state of media discourse about religion. We really need to deal with that. Occasionally you get a wonderful reporter which takes the time to develop some really nuanced understandings of religion. And when that happens, my jaw drops because I no longer expect it. And so this is something that I really do think we've got to work much harder on.
Short question, but it might be a longer answer. You picking up on the question about practices. I know that the ABS study there's been reflections on certain practices. So I'm wondering if you talked about war. Could you maybe give us an example maybe on altruism or something, and how that has then worked itself out across religious, non-religious?
I tried to briefly allude that religious identification is tied into significant differences in things like charitable giving and giving of time and volunteering. And actually we know that as people convert into religion, that their levels of giving in these areas increases. And actually the lag, if they deconvert, they're slower to lose it. They're quicker to gain it and slower to lose it. Environmental regard, how they feel about climate change and what they'll be prepared or what they are doing in response to that. Religious people report higher levels of efficacy. They're less likely to believe that humans are responsible for climate change, but they also express high levels of commitment to doing something and much greater levels of belief that they're doing something can make a difference. Just off the top of my head, a couple of things.
Sweet. Lucky last question. Sorry, sir, was at the back. Oh, you asked your question? Okay, well, we can have yours, sir. Thank you.
Going back to this lady's question, there's a prominent thinker in the UK who agrees that there should be a very wide range of religious education in schools that but gives a very diverse set of views on all the religions, major religions in the world. And this will have the result of less and less religion as children learn how to compare one religion's content with another and conclude that they're all fiction. And his name is Richard Dawkins.
I'm sure Philip won't be able to resist saying something about Richard Dawkins, but partly that notion is a classic secularisation thesis that people have mostly abandoned. The idea that pluralism is, the more that people know about religions, they just throw their hands up and say, oh, it's all rubbish. So this isn't actually borne out in the data. It's not how it works.
Yeah, I think that's wishful thinking from Dawkins' part. I see no good reason to think that religious pluralism results in irreligion. I think that's extraordinary naivety on Dawkins' part. So, yeah.
Awesome. Hey, let's just thank Geoff and Phil again, but before we do, just wanted to add my thanks and I guess, just thank you for your encouragement for Christians, actually. I think sometimes it's easy in conversations like this to, as you say, feel like we're under the cosh and that we've got our backs to the wall, but I think those of us who do believe we've got a good story to tell, and a story that is, hopeful and purposeful, you encouraged us with, I even have the exact words here, we've got thinking about ethics, practices, ontologies, ritual, generosity and hope that the wider community needs and that are, we believe, true. And so don't give up if you're Christian, and if you're not, well, we should find out about you and you should find out about us. I'd just like to close with a prayer, which comes from our New Zealand prayer book. I'm going to adapt it slightly. God of the Southern Sea and of these islands, of Māori, Pākehā, and of all who dwell in our land, we give you thanks and praise for our country and for what we have achieved together. Increase our trust in one another, strengthen our quest for justice, and whatever differences we have, bring us to unity and common purpose. Through Jesus Christ our Lord we pray. Amen. Just before we give these guys a big round of applause, do feel free to stick around, have another cup of tea and another glass of wine, a few more nibbles, and in 2 weeks' time we've got Professor Robert Asen talking about geopolitics and whether there is any place left for values in the world of dog eat dog that we seem to inhabit presently. So come back in 2 weeks for that. Geoff and Phil, thank you very much.